Yeah, don't be quiet.
Yeah, so good morning. We're doing the fifth part of our Green Skills program with Bedford Borough Council. And it's on supply chain. So well done for getting this far. This is where we are in our journey. And today will all be about supply chain strategies, tools, tactics, what larger businesses are doing, but also how you can apply that to SMEs. So as we've said before, it's part of a 5-part program. It's very kindly funded for you to attend from Bedford Borough Council, and supported by the government. We have got, these are all being recorded, and there's will be some resources sent out afterwards, as well as a certificate to earn, which will look a little bit like that. Just introducing ourselves, but I think you know us by now, Rondi Allen and Nick Riley. So we're from Sustainable X, and we are a sustainability consultancy who supports businesses from wherever they are today to accelerate progress on their sustainability topics. So just as a recap, we've covered a lot in these 5 sessions, and this is the icing on the cake. So we've touched on carbon, literacy, looked all around what is sustainability, what is zero waste and resources, which is really important on the agenda. Session 3 was action-packed, talking about materiality, greenwashing, stakeholders, communication, the frameworks around sustainability, what strategies and impacts you might have in your business or with what you do. Session 4, we talked a lot about the people and the risk and the governance. And last but not least, we're going to touch on supply chain. So we've broken the session down into 4 parts. So we really want to talk about why supply chain is so important and in a sustainable business, what practices and policies and building that in, what you would do to improve your sustainability, what you do to reduce your impact, and then the compliance and future trends, and we'll talk a bit about B Corp as well, because that's something that is we often get asked to explain or talk about or just bring everyone up to speed on. In terms of timing, if you can do the maths, we don't think we'll take 2 hours today, so we'll go but we have allocated the whole time. So if you do have any questions, as Nick said, put your hand up or just stop us. We'll try and take a breath at the right places so you can ask any questions you have. So we're very happy to answer them. Supply chain stuff is really tricky, and it is probably the most complicated area in sustainability, and it's also complicated for big businesses. It is really, really difficult to do, and we'll explain why, but to understand what your supply chain is from back to the very basics, just even mapping your supply chain gets tricky, let alone recording the data and then making improvements. But that's that shouldn't stop us. We should still progress, and it's important to watch what big companies are doing because they know how important this is, and they're making great strides in tackling the challenges. So in terms of a classic supply chain, hi Dave.
Morning, apologies for late arrival.
No worries.
No problem at all. In terms of a linear supply chain, you have your supply, your procurement, inventory and logistics. If you have a product-based business, manufacturing, then you distribute back to your customer. So it's everything that's involved in the product getting to service, excluding the functional areas. It's the chain of the product or the service, but it's the process along there.
Okay, so why is it important? So it's for Dave's benefit. We split it into 4 sections today, Dave. So why are we worried about having a sustainable supply chain? And it's this holistic picture that you can't, in a very sort of simple example, if you're selling a widget to your customers and you're telling your customers, yeah, we're a super green business, we recycle in our shop or we recycle in our office and we've got sustainable electricity, but that widget comes from somewhere where they've got slave labor and they use coal-fired power and it's just a shocker, then you can't claim to be a sustainable business. So you need to know what's happening in your supply chain to know whether you can claim that and know whether you've got any challenges. So it's really being transparent, and a sustainable business is transparent about their whole value chain from raw materials all the way through to what happens with the product when the customer's finished with it or the service. So in terms of the why, we've broken it down into three chunks. So the environmental impact, and when we talked about the carbon, obviously the scope 3 is a big deal, and there's stats on what's the most significant part of people's carbon footprint, and somewhere between 70 and 90% of carbon footprints typically are in your supply chain. So that's a big number, and getting to understand that is a challenge. But it's not just the carbon from the environmental side of things. If you think of it in terms of raw materials, where they're coming from, are they sustainably produced? If you think of water, if you think of energy. So there's lots of different aspects to the environmental topics that you would be looking at in your supply chain. And then on the social side of things, this is the labour conditions piece. So could there be slave labour happening in your supply chain? Are the materials, raw materials, ethically sourced? So you've got different tiers of supply chain. So your raw materials might be worked nicely by people who are treated really well, but they were originally mined somewhere else and the people were treated really badly. So right the way through to the source of the materials. And there's an environmental angle on the materials as well. Are they contributing to deforestation? Are they contributing to pollution? So there are challenges in there. But the big thing on the social thing in supply chain is human rights. And when you look at the different frameworks, as we have done previously, human rights is kind of omnipresent in every one of them on the social side of things. So that is the big challenge.
Give me a next slide, Nick, when you're ready.
Next slide. So on the economic side of things, there are opportunities to save money, particularly on waste. So when you look at the materials sourcing side of things, if there is lots of waste at lots of different stages, there's often opportunities to save money. On transportation, when people look at it in anger, can they optimize the transportation so there's less shipments, or they're not using planes, they're using shipping more, or they bring it into a different port. So there can be some upsides in there. And there's also economic benefits. There's a choice with this, but there are economic, if you go local, that kind of real positive impact on your community. But if you think of it in a worldwide sense, if you get it from an area that's economically disadvantaged in China or India or someone else, then you're probably having a real positive contribution to their economy and their standard of living, which can be a really good thing. So it's not clean cut as to whether you go locally or overseas. Okay, next slide, Roddy. So in terms of the types of risks in supply chain, classically, you look at your internal risks that you control, a little bit like the carbon footprint. You've got the things you can control and the things that happen externally. In supply chain, there are lots of challenges. So will the raw materials continue to be available for the period of time you want? Is the quantity of raw materials appropriate? Could there be environmental risk impacting those materials, or their production elsewhere, or their transportation to you? During COVID, there was lots of examples on the shipping side of things. When worldwide shipping got backed up, that had huge impacts on some businesses in the UK. Then there is legal risk as well, in terms of prosecutions and challenges if you're not complying with local laws and regulations in other countries, if you're not keeping an eye on that as well. So there are lots of things that can happen in the supply chain which could have a catastrophic impact on your business in the UK. Typically, this is where you've got overseas business and you're manufacturing something, or you're importing or transporting products. So if it's a service-based business, you're less likely to have a lot of these challenges. But people do offshore a lot of functions. So a lot of people get support from the Philippines. A lot of people get work done in India. So service businesses do have challenges in this space as well. Okay, Rondi.
So we've just pulled some examples of core supply chain management, and one of the risks for businesses is the exposure that it can really cause. And these are real examples. Workers' rights, we see this. This is one of the biggest things we do see in the sustainability space. And we've got Primark and M&S being called out, Shein being called out for workers' rights. And that is the one thing that is really being, I mean, we see it all the time. These are old stories, but we see this all the time. So that's a massive risk to these businesses. Probably Primark and Shein are pretty used to it by now. And I don't know if that really, it might impact the investor side, but it might impact the consumer side. M&S, that's a whole nother, they're a different type of retailer, and that really could impact, a scandal like this could really impact their consumer base. Biodiversity, we see this a lot as well. If a company's been procuring illegal timber, in this case, or impacting biodiversity, or using palm oil and they're destroying the forest because of palm oil plantations, once again, reputational risk and challenge. So there's a lot of panorama type investigations on things. We've all seen this. Waste is another big thing. There's a huge amount of stories around companies that are not very conservative with their waste, and this is the laundry detergent one, and the plastic packaging around that. But at the moment, I think it's still price point. Even despite the scandals, people will still use what is affordable to them. So unless there's price parity, I'm not sure this is shifting the market, but there are changes afoot and there'll be regulations in play. So, and there are regulations on plastic tax as well. So that's starting to impact. And this is garment waste here, big story about Nike, Clarks and other leading brands leading to toxic kilns in Cambodia. So obviously, as Nick said, to international supply chains and huge reputational risk for businesses and exposure and potentially valuation of their businesses at the larger scale.
Yeah, and on the health and safety side of things, so Dyson were pulled up in this example, but again, we see this a lot. In their case, this was migrant workers being treated very poorly. And when something like this happens in your supply chain, fixing it's hard, because you've got demand, you've got a whole supply chain, so you can't just turn it off. So how do you fix it? How do you improve that reputation? It's a big hit to your business in terms of time and resource, as well as clearly the wrong thing to be involved with. The legal companies now are increasingly advising their customers what to do, but some of them are also deciding what sort of organizations they will represent, and others are providing, I don't know what's happening there, Rondi. Others are providing free kind of pro bono support to activist groups and people who have a claim to make. So things like clean air and those sort of issues, you have some legal firms who are really going to town on helping people with those claims against large corporates. So where before you might have had a bit of activist action, now you've got the threat of legal action coming on the back of that. And people have to defend themselves, and it's happened in broadcasting, it's happened in lots of situations. And if there's a trend in anything on this front, it's not just people making an accusation now, it's people bringing a prosecution. So the big thing here is, if you're going to have a sustainable brand, your supply chain has to be squeaky clean. So you have to know what's happening, and you have to be able to measure what your impacts are and the key impacts. So it's a little bit like everything else we've done so far on sustainability and what's important and how do you measure it, et cetera, et cetera. That just gets shifted onto your supply chain. So where do you start? And we start with mapping. So we know it's a big deal. You've got to know where it is and what it is. And depending on your organization, that could be a simple exercise. but it can be really complex, as the next slide will show. And there's lots of ways to do it. But fundamentally, you're trying to go right the way back to what are the raw materials in your product or service, and where do they come from, and tracking those all the way through their mining, production, treatment processes, to their inclusion in products, to their distribution, right the way through to it hits your premises, if that makes sense. So this is an example from Nudie Jeans, which we love.
We've used this one before. It's our favorite.
Yep.
Everyone's seen this one.
Have we done this one already? Okay, cool.
Yeah. But
yeah.
I wanted to bring it out again.
Yeah, because it's really good. And we've highlighted on here just some of the negative impacts. And it's such a long supply chain. I think that's the big thing here. I mean, some jeans manufacturers might just come in at the maker's label stage. It might literally, it's nothing to do with them until it gets into the labeling bit. Even that could be outsourced. So when you look at the kind of waste at the different stages upstream, so you've got pollutants at the weaving stage. When they do the cuts, there's off cuts that need to be disposed of. Is that happening in an effective way? Can you reduce it in any way? The chemicals in the detergents when they're cleaned, and then this distressed jeans. So when I was reviewing this slide just yesterday, looking at it, I just thought it's a shocker that we waste energy making things look like they're old. You know, what are we doing? What is wrong with us? Absolutely nuts. And there's chemical waste from that process. Unbelievable. So I love this diagram because it really brings it to life. So when you look at the company, which is that sort of second column from the right, look at all the suppliers that are upstream, the downstream. No, they are upstream. Sorry, get it the right way around. Right the way back to the raw materials. So there's multiple raw materials going in there, come from different sources, potentially from different countries, and that means there's probably a transportation business in between the raw materials and then the fabric suppliers, of which there are multiple. And then there's distribution from them to the dye houses, and there'll be multiple dye houses. And then the actual manufacturing process sub to lots of different places. Good business practice. But geez, tracking all of that is a real challenge. And when you get to sorry if you go back one, Rondi, when you get to you've got the business, then you've got your distribution that you pay for through third parties. That should be easier to track, but often they'll subcontract as well. So there's tier 2 on that level as well. So it's really, really complex when you get in there, and yeah, challenging.
And I think we talked to just bringing it to life, we talked to a hospital bed manufacturer recently, and they're trying to measure their carbon footprint and the life cycle, the carbon of their individual hospital bed that they make. But all the nuts and bolts come from different places, and depending that it's the same nut or same bolt that comes from, it might come from Lithuania or it might come from China, which is sourced in different ways. The carbon footprint's completely different. And he's just it's just a minefield to try and just not only measure the labour conditions of those different plants, but the carbon of the same product. And yeah, absolute, which probably has the same product number in their system. If you're thinking about the master data, it's really, really challenging. So sorry, Nick, for hijacking.
No, that's right. Yeah, so fundamentally the process is, what are the raw materials, and what can you break down your product or service in terms of inputs? So you need to map out, for our product or service, these are the material inputs or the people inputs that go on. And then you would map your first tier of suppliers, so the people you deal with directly. And then a really challenging stage beyond that is who supplies them. And that can be a challenge because that is often commercially sensitive. They don't want to disclose it, or they're worried from a competitive perspective that if they reveal that, you might go direct to them. So that can be a real challenge to get that second tier. And there's often a third tier beyond that as well. And so when you look at large corporates on their reporting, often in terms of their supply chain progress, they talk about the percentage of their tier 1s that they have reached and engaged with, the percentage of tier 2s that they've reached and engaged with, and the percentage of tier 3s that they've reached and engaged with, before we get into what you engage with them on and what their topics are. So that step, once you get past tier 1, it's hard yards. It is hard yards, but you go as far as you can, and you don't let perfect get in the way of good. So you get as much depth as you can, and then you want to map it and map it out, and then start to try and quantify which percentage of your raw materials or your labor or whatever comes from which bits. And that's what draws your eye to, right, where will we focus our attention? Because it's such a big area, you need to focus in initially and not try and solve everything in one hit. So this is a company we've worked with before that does supply chain mapping, and they kind of take people's supply chain book, and they've got really good AI systems and strength, and they pull it all in and map it out. And as an initial pass, they actually, based on where the suppliers are located and the historic risks from lots of different sources in that area, they give it a sort of risk rating, and you can flag up quantities, etc. And so that just maps it all out, and that will probably post you towards, well, actually most supplies from within Europe are relatively low risk, but there are other areas where there are higher risks as well. So that just focuses your attention on which suppliers to try and tune into quickest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this would be an example for something like John Lewis. They have 476 suppliers at multiple tiers, and they've got to collect all the data. So this supply chain mapping is not for the faint-hearted at the major, at a big company level. It really does need a tool in place to make it happen, and then identify the risks associated. So this is an example, quite a good screen. To map supply chains on that challenge is the biggest thing we've seen is businesses do not want to share. They don't want to reveal their sources. They don't want the competitive advantage. They don't want to tell you where the tier 2 is. You know your first tier, but to go to a deeper level, that is the biggest challenge. So very difficult for businesses. It's really hard to get accurate data. We've done some supply chain exercises for our clients, and to get anything out of suppliers, A, they don't have the information, or B, just that it's not really reliable. They're not sure what you're talking about. So it's pretty difficult to get it, but you've got to start somewhere, as Nick said.
And there is a C. Yeah. There's a C to that, which is the time of it. This is often, depending on the culture, they don't want to lose face, the suppliers. So you ask them for the data, and it's yes, we'll get you that. And you chase and you chase and you chase, and then it takes months to get to the fact, no, we haven't actually got it. But culturally, they're not willing to disclose that, so that's a challenge.
So depending on locations, reporters have also got different. They use different metrics. So you then have to work out on your end what you're asking and what they're reporting and how it works for you, because the inconsistent standards and the comparisons are really tricky. Like, it's really hard to work out where you are, and that's where the bigger tools systems come in, like that client example we had before. Different countries have different rules, they have different maturity, and it's harder to access sustainability. This is really a big challenge in this space. And internally, when you're mapping these supply chains, it does take a lot of time and a lot of effort. So it's a resource hungry space. So you've really got to be sure why you're doing it, and why your business case is for you. It's important for you, what the most important thing is. And we sort of touched on that before, but very tricky.
What depth you go into.
Yeah.
Because it can be a never-ending challenge.
So building in practices. So we know it's supply chain's important. It has a lot of reputational risk, environmental opportunity, and carbon, but it's a difficult mapping exercise. So what would you do first? But just to recap, when we talk about sustainability, we do talk about all aspects of sustainability. So we're talking about the people side, which is coming to modern slave labour, the prosperity, the innovation, the partnerships, the governance around sustainability, as well as the planet and the environmental, including biodiversity, which we touched on earlier with Pip, and talk about that. So when you're starting to assess your supply chain, how would you do it? Just where do you start? And there's two different aspects to think about in terms of starting sustainability. First is, you could assess your current suppliers. Do you assess them and benchmark or baseline where they are today? And that's quite a nice way to go, because you already have a relationship with them and you can start to ask this inquisitive question. And that's our biggest message from all of these. Anything we do talking is ask questions of people what they're doing in a really sort of inquisitive, educational, non-sort of accusational way. So if you started to assess what your current clients are doing, it's current suppliers, it's quite a nice, easy way to get going and seeing what they're doing. The challenge is when they give you your answers, what are you going to do with them? Because they'll be expecting something back. They'll be expecting to see you release a new policy, or they might be expecting change. So you get all this information back, and then what? So it's important to have a next step and a what you're going to do. Or another approach could be start applying criteria to any new contracts or any new tenders or any renewals. So you start afresh. So anything that's coming in is good. The benefit of that is you can start afresh, and you're saying now with this new contract, you're not rewriting the rules for old suppliers, but from the new contract, you're expecting this minimum level of sustainability to be applied. The challenge on that is they might then come back and ask what you're doing. So it needs to be part of a bigger picture, a bigger in line with the rest of your sustainability as a business. You need to be moving. The best practice would be to moving all of your business as well as your supply chain along at the same sort of rate. So then you can be. If you got challenged, you can talk about the journey that you're on as well. So it's quite a collaborative approach. So when you're assessing your support, sorry, was that you, Nick? Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. So yeah, how do you work out what to assess them against? And we won't labour this because we've done it a lot in terms of the previous sessions, particularly on the materiality side of things. So it was when you worked out what topics were important for your organisation, you did look at the customers, your industry, what regulations there are, what the competitors were doing, what the stakeholders were doing, and particularly your internal stakeholders and your customers. Those are the two big drivers. And that's created your topic list. So in terms of what you're asking your suppliers, it should absolutely relate to the topics that are important for you that you'd already identified in your assessment process. And there are different depths to go. And depending on the nature of your supply chain, we quite like the concept of starting soft. If you're speaking to your existing suppliers, rather than making this for the new, as Rondi described, so step one and two that she just mentioned, then starting off quite softly. Are you doing this? Yes, no type questions, opportunities to describe what they're doing is quite a nice way to start. It's not like a big intimidating bang. So this is just an example of some self-assessment questions.
And we've given you this self-assessment in the tools. So that's one of the tools for this one. This simple self-assessment is coming to you shortly. And
this is longer than some people put out. And some people just start off with, what are you doing on sustainability? This is just one page, and that's okay. Normally if people are doing that, we do encourage them to say, what are you doing on sustainability? We're starting to assess, and in future years we'll start to ask you more detailed questions, and so you're kind of mapping, we're going to start doing this, and it's almost like an early warning to get there. But then something
like this, Nick, sorry, when you get the results back, you may only get 20% of your suppliers responding, but at least then you've got a metric to say next year I'd like 25 to respond or 30 to respond, or we'll work harder. At least you've got even that to say of the 20%, so you know you've got some measures at least to baseline.
Or you can go to the board and say, hey, it's unlikely we're going to get very far. with a questionnaire on existing suppliers, I think we need to go to option 2, where we make it a contract criteria, and that'll give you an indication. Where if you went out and everybody came back with War and Peace, and here's our carbon reduction plan, and here's what we're doing with the supply chain, then you're thinking, oh, actually, we probably don't need to do so much on the contract requirements. But often people will ask for specific metrics, and there are common topics out there. So carbon, absolutely, that's the one we see all the time. There are some of the frameworks we mentioned before, like CDP, which was formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. People ask them, have they completed that questionnaire? Have they completed an EcoVadis assessment? And there are carbon questions specifically in there. On waste, some sectors, we're working with a couple of retail wholesale distribution businesses now. It's not their customers asking, their suppliers are asking them what they're doing on waste. And if they can't satisfy the supplier's waste requirements, then the supplier won't allow them to be their distributor. So that's a different challenge to them, but they are being asked for specific data and targets on their waste reduction side of things. So have we included this example as well, Ronnie?
Yeah.
So this is a kind of War and Peace version. So if you really wanted to go to town, it's got lots of different categories, from environmental management, climate change, all the human rights type questions. So there's multiple tabs on the assessment, and there's lots of questions in there. So it would be pretty intimidating to a supplier to receive that if they've never heard from you about sustainability before. So we would suggest you wouldn't go big bang with one of those, but we've just included it for reference purposes.
Yeah, and it might be a useful tool just to take the bits out that you like.
Yeah.
But you've got this coming in an Excel spreadsheet. So the key, and there's a really, really great, I can find it, I'll resend it on if anyone's interested, but there's a really great Harvard Business Review did a great study on sustainable supply chains, and they said the key thing to being more sustainable in your supply chain is finding the right person to talk to, because typically someone in purchasing or sourcing will talk to sales from the other team, and the salesperson, this is not their bag. They don't know the technical. They've just got a selling sheet, and they just go forward and sell and build that customer relationship from that side. So this is a new way of businesses having to talk to each other. You really need the sustainability people talking to the sustainability people if they have them. So it is really critical to find the right person to get the right answer. And I can't tell you how many times we've gone into a client and said, do you have a carbon footprint? No. And then, then we bump into one somewhere, 6 months later that someone else in the organization has done it, because they're not all talking, they're doing things for different reasons. So it's really not very joined up, but that's the number one key thing to do. Is to find the right person to talk to. When you talk to them, what do you do then? You've got this information, then what? And I think this is a big question for businesses, and it goes back to what the root cause of why you are trying to improve your supply chain. What are you actually going to do with their responses? Where are you going to store them? What are you going to analyze from them? What are you going to make changes from? Are you going to set targets or supply? So this is not something we're going to touch on specifically today, but it is really just considering what you will do with those that information, how you're going to measure it, what your ambition is, what good looks like to you, and it possibly, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the next session, it might be possible to look at someone in a bigger organisation in your sector and what they're reporting on, and start to align your reporting measures and your targets with what they are and what they care about and the way they're talking about it. That might be because it will drive everything. So it might be easier to start from the end and say, well, what are we going to do with these answers when we get them back? How is it going to change anything, or what are we going to do? So really important.
Okay, so environmental impact, will a very rapid refresher on the carbon side of things. So scope 3 is obviously key. If the nature of your business is that scope 3 is that big chunk, that 70, 80, 90% of them, then getting in the supply chain to reduce them is the challenge. So how do you tackle that? You kind of, once you know what it is, geez, that's a big number. How do you fix it? So just bringing some examples to life. Next slide, Rondi. Diageo, big drinks producer, they look, so 93% of their emissions in scope 3. So that's massive. A third of it is in the packaging, but for them, packaging is typically glass. So the glass bottles they're shipping all around the world, that's a hell of a lot of weight, and it's a big challenge. So 20% of their carbon effectively is the glass that all their drinks go around the world in. So really tough thing to challenge. So they're not challenging it on their own. There's an industry body has been created that's Glass Futures, and they've become a key player within Glass Futures. So it's kind of, let's solve this together, everybody, because it's a common challenge. And if you combine R&D effort on there, then you've got much more chance of cracking the problem. And also, it's a little bit like, I think we used the big and mighty example before. When you want that industry shift, you need that joint collaboration, because if one person all of a sudden, if the whole drinks industry went from glass to, I know they won't, but they went to cardboard cartons, you probably wouldn't sell the Johnny Walker Black Label whiskey, wouldn't sell compared to one that's in a glass bottle on the same shelf. But if they were all in cartons and that was the way you got whiskey from now on, hey, maybe that works. So those are the sort of challenges. And for a small, medium-sized business, your best opportunity is to collaborate with other people, whether that's your suppliers or joining in with an industry body. To take action on your own be really, really hard. So the collaboration route really kicks in if you're an SME, for sure.
So in terms of packaging waste, IHG Hotels, I think they're Hilton, maybe a Holiday Inns, they put out really, I really liked what they were doing on packaging waste. Big move from reducing single use, absolute, like, divert food and resources. And it was really, really interesting to me. And it seems a bit obvious, actually, that they should be crying in terms of all that resource use and moving to a circular economy. But there's another better example. So this was strong. There was a better example after. What we tried to do in this part is talk about what big companies are doing, that how a SME might also apply a tactic. And the tactic that we wanted to bring, and I don't think we've told you before about the badminton example. Have we mentioned the badminton example before on packaging? So we had a session like this once upon a time, and there was someone from a sports club, and they used badminton shuttlecocks, and they got in touch with us after, and we were saying, ask the question, and they wrote to the producer of their shuttlecocks, and I think they were a big international producer, massive, well-known brand, and they contacted them a bit like Pip contacted our other
Waterstone.
Other example. So this person contacted them, and they asked them about what they could do. They throw so many shuttlecocks away in their club. What could they do about them? And they quite openly shared that one are fully recyclable and one are compostable. So you can just put it in your compost bin. So you can either stick the old ones, and they've been throwing them in landfill. And the individual said, well, you don't have that on your packaging. And the company said, we didn't think anybody cared. And so it was really interesting just how much. Now, I haven't checked the packaging to see if it now says these ones are recyclable or these ones are compostable. The power of asking a question could well reduce for an SME. You just don't know what's going to happen if you ask the question. Have you got a packet though, Nick?
No, I haven't got the packet. But this is an old one. So it's a feather shuttle. So it's fully compostable. That's the thing. But you wouldn't, you would think that the end of it was plastic, but it's not. And it is fully recyclable. Yeah.
Yeah. So for an SME, I mean, this asking the question just has so much impact.
And so just another example on that was a facilities management company we work with. And again, on Rondi's 1-2 example, they made it a contract requirement. So if you want to, when they put any request for materials or products out there, it was, we do not accept any single-use plastics. in our packaging. Please confirm that you will not provide any single-use plastics, otherwise you will not be paid. So they made it a criteria. So they eliminated single-use plastic. It was a big jump, and it meant that some products weren't available to them. So it was a challenge for them. But after a year of a bit of teething problems, they got there, and they were able to find sources for everything they needed.
So in terms of resource use, this is Nestle, and they're really a bit. I think we used a horticulture example as well about how these big food manufacturers are really supporting and looking at resource and waste and for water, reusing water and capturing it and reusing it in different ways. And this is what Nestle's doing. Lots of different things on resource use. With one of our SME clients, they have a part of their scrap. They cut big sheets of a technical product, and they were having quite sheets of bits of scrap, almost like fabric, but it wasn't fabric. It was a material they couldn't use for anything. And then someone came to them and asked them if they could use it for their craft club and making jewelry and doing all sorts of things. And in actual fact, it's become now another profit center for them because they're able to sell it on and use that scrap material as an input for something else. And we've talked about a few of those things in circular economy as well. But just thinking about other uses of scrap and what you can do and saving your resources. We covered a lot of that in resources, but it's a good example. I have got quite a nice video. It's only 1:30, so I think I'll play it, hopefully, if you can hear. Just got to make sure you can hear it because I can't test, but can you let me know if you can hear it? Can you hear
Nope.
it? Nice. There's got to be a button. Does anyone know how that works on more video effects? Anyone know how that works? Share the sound, or do we just skip the video? We could send it in the link.
I think we'll have to send a link.
Yeah, it's not my special skill. We'll send a link, but it's a really great resource is Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So if anyone hasn't bumped into that before, that's a fantastic resource, and this was particularly a good one.
Yeah, on circular economy, they've got lots of worked examples and videos, and yeah, it is really, really strong.
And resources, yeah.
Yeah, and so back on the IHG, just as an example, and we've bumped into this in a real life supplier way, and I'm not sure it's with IHG, but they introduced an option, a standard where they want 100% wool or 100% recycled nylon carpets and they do a lot. They're a big source of carpet use, hotels, in that sort of that whole hospitality sector. So if that happened worldwide, that's a massive impact. And there's a big carpet supplier up north that we've been doing some work with, because they now have to have a sort of life cycle analysis of their product, and that has to be completed this year. And within 2 years, they have to have 100% recyclable carpet if they want to continue working with their biggest customers, who's 75% of their business. So that has set the cat amongst the pigeons hugely for them, because at the minute they don't. So that in terms of a supplier request and a sector moving, so there's lots of them doing this at the same time, that is changing a supply chain sector. And you imagine if they retool to supply to this sector, it'll probably have a knock-on effect to residential supply and things as well. So that can be an enormous change, because customers have started to say, hey, we want a recyclable product.
It's created a whole nother secondary industry for what you do with recycled carpet, like how you recycle, like who's going to recycle this carpet?
Yeah.
You need a processing option for that without adding,
But they get through it in a couple of years, so it is quite it's quite a big volume.
Yeah, but recycling carpet has not been a thing until now.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. So just a little SME example, and you're thinking, well, geez, for small companies, you're not going to be able to make that demand or make the change, and you would be uneconomical to do it on your own, so it doesn't make sense. So there's a little company we work with, CD UK. They do like surfaces, like counters you'll see in a McDonald's or a Starbucks or anywhere like that. And they're just as a sort of signal to the market, they put lots of samples out to people, and they try and get the samples back so that they're not creating lots of different samples. It's on a sort of circular loop. So it's a nice small little step. But subsequently, they now actually have got, they take back worktops and re sort of work them and give them back to clients as different products. So they've really embraced the circular economy piece. But it started with, hey, we'll take our samples back. And that put the antennas of their customers up to say, oh, that's interesting. Talk to us about what you're doing. And that created other ideas. So that dialogue, that talking to people can start from quite a small step. So education, we love it in terms of our little business impact and the social value. We try and create education as our thing. We try to do free talks and training sessions for people. But for a service-based business like PwC in this case, a big thing for them is providing that information and educating their supply chain and their customers. So they do a lot of education materials and put sustainability knowledge out there. It's a good resource for everybody to look at. But as an SME, again, you can point people towards ways to get certified. So if you're saying to your supply chain, hey, we really want you to tell us your carbon footprint, and a lot of suppliers won't know where to start, you can signpost them to places like the SME Climate Hub, where it'll help them through that process and make it easy for them. But there are other resources out there. So it's not just a case of saying, hey, suppliers, give us this. It's, hey, give us this. And if you don't know where to start, here's where we suggest you start. So you're sharing that knowledge. So technology, again, we've talked about it before, a big enabler, that sort of efficiency side of things. In this case, we're highlighting in the fashion world, blockchain, where almost each product has a digital passport, which has that raw material information and transport information and all the attributes of the product, follow it all the way through its life. And maybe there's a barcode or I've forgotten the name of those wee square things now, where you can you can scan it and it'll tell you about that product. So again, as an SME, you would struggle to do that. But I think the example we have here, Andy, if you click on the digitization piece, what can you do with suppliers? What information can they bring forward that you can bring through your own systems? And often the easy place to start is at the invoice stage. So there's some extra information comes with their invoice, and you can suck that into the product records if that's something you do and it's relevant to your business.
Has anyone been to Next and ever returned anything without a receipt? They know on the exact thing that you've bought, which card, somehow that's tracked to that individual item. It is absolutely amazing. They've been doing it for ages, like a couple of years. And that blows me away that I know that if I dropped that by the side of the road or threw it out, they might be able to find who bought it. Like it's absolutely phenomenal that somehow they do the individual tracking on products or clothes.
There's starting to another one, which is a good example of this, is on fly tipping now. So where lots of goods are fly tipped and there's a big pile of things there, some people have taken the effort to try and track the product back, and they're able to work out who it was sold to and say to them, hey, you haven't ethically disposed of this product. So that would be a great thing if that was to take off.
Yeah, amazing.
So this is really good, and just gives an example of, remember we showed you the mapping tool. So I imagine that Tesco's have used a mapping tool out there, and from that mapping, they've identified particular product lines where the risk is really high. And particularly they're looking at the poverty aspect. So these tools that you can apply different things. So is there an environmental risk? Is there a poverty risk? And in this case, there's a UN data piece, which has a poverty index that relates to different geographic locations. So that's gone into the system where their tier 1s and 2s for these products live are in there, and it's flagged up. It's almost created hotspots of where the risks are. So then they're focusing on those products specifically to understand what that poverty position is and how can they contribute to moving the dial. So that is really strong, and yeah, I like it. So for SMEs, harder. Again, how are you going to actually move the dial on something that's happening in China or India or wherever else it might be? And this is the Mama Bamboo example. I think we mentioned before is the sustainable nappies, and they're trying to create a positive impact. Whilst their bamboo doesn't come from this area, they're sponsoring a village in Uganda, and they help them. Their money helps them farm in a more environmentally friendly way that creates higher yields. The bamboo grows on marginal land, so that land couldn't have been used to grow crops. So they're supporting this bamboo village, and it's supporting their income, it's supporting education, so it's having environmental impacts, it's having social impacts, it's a multi-dimensional impacts on all the topics that are important to Mama Bamboo. So it's a really nice way, if they're going to put their money anywhere, they're putting it somewhere that hits all their key impact areas.
So in terms of diversity and inclusion, I found that Sky is doing a great program improving diversity and inclusion in their supply chain. And they have got a commitment with a Race at Work charter, but that is making sure that everybody in their supply chain has this same commitment as well. So they're working on these diverse businesses as part of their supply chain. So that's fantastic, and they're looking to support that wherever their customers are and wherever their suppliers are. In terms of SMEs, once again, you have to start to measure where you are, and I'll share an example on the next slide. So if you don't know where you are, and if you are not supporting in diverse communities or diverse businesses ownership, then you don't know if you need to move the dial. So what I've shared here is a sneak peek of our impact report. We haven't issued it yet, but it does have the diversity aspect. And the three things that we measure as a business are the number of suppliers that are SMEs.
I think if you click it blows up, Ronnie, doesn't it?
Does it? Oh, right. Okay. That's better. So in that we measure it every year, and this year we've got 71% of our suppliers are SMEs, which we really want to support SMEs and economic growth. Sadly, we were much higher, but now we're only 10% female owned. So we know that's an area, being fully transparent, that's an area that we need to think about and work on or work towards or support more. And 46% of our businesses that we work with are local to us, which is in 20, we've defined that as 25.
Okay, Dave.
By Dave.
Yep.
25 miles of where we work. So for SMEs, the way to show evidence or support is understanding where you are. That's the most important thing and to think about and measure. So in terms of climate risk for businesses, this is an example of a mapping exercise which shows in in China and in the US where the biggest weather risks are and climate risks are for starting a business. And there's a really great example of P&G that they strategically placed their factory in Louisiana or wherever down by Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans. Pardon?
New Orleans.
New Orleans, yeah. And they put it on a site they checked all the climate risks, wind risk and flood risk. And by doing that, when Hurricane Katrina came, they were managing to still deliver coffee to everybody. And I think it kept, held that business. If they hadn't done that, they would have lost a lot of business. I think this one factory supplies something ridiculous like 30 or 40% of the coffee in the US. So it was really fundamental for the business and the supply chain and the customers. For an SME, it's really thinking about the climate risk and the transition risk for your business, because your clients are asking you, and the banks might ask, and the banks are asking. So if you do have temperature sensitive material that we've used this example before, but temperature sensitive material that you're delivering to clients and you can't deliver that in extreme weather conditions, it's worth having a think about what that risk might look like, or how much you might need to invest to mitigate that risk. So it's having a plan on your climate risk. You might not be able to move factories if you're an SME, but it's the thinking around the climate transition.
Okay, so what's coming up and what are people working on? What are we seeing going on? A big thing is having a code of conduct for your suppliers and asking them to sign up to it. And the exercise of creating the code of conduct kind of helps define the topics that are important to you and what sort of expectations. So it's a good place to start, and there are lots of examples out there. Lots of people have already done it, so there's lots of things you can magpie to help inform what you do and what you ask. Some people switch products, so when you look at the products you're using, particularly as an SME, you've got a bit more choice. So you can choose to have recycled paper, for instance, where you had non-recycled before. So there are lots of things you can change based on simple procurement decisions. You can also switch suppliers, but if someone's international and very bad, or has a bad reputation, or you see they don't talk, Waterstones is a good example, someone we know recently mentioned. Maybe don't get your books from them until they sort their act out in terms of their publications. So there are lots of things you can do in there, and having a bit of a plan for what you're going to do with your supply chain. So as we mentioned earlier, it's quite a big bang to go from nothing to a really comprehensive supply chain assessment. So having a staged plan saying, right, we're going to engage people to let them know we're on the case. Then we're going to ask some simple questions, and then we're going to make it a buying criteria by X date. And sharing that strategy with them is a good sort of transparent way to go. As you get down the track then, and you're getting more data from people, that's great. But there comes an issue, do you trust the data? So there is an element of checking. And again, you mightn't check everyone, but you might focus on the areas which are higher volume or higher risk, or whatever those issues are. You might start to put those terms in your contracts and in your buying criteria and in your request for information as well. And when you're sourcing things, you're taking that sustainability perspective into account. In one of the previous sessions, we talked about the sort of sustainable decision-making criteria, is putting those sustainable decision-making criteria into your design and procurement decisions. Is there a more sustainable option for this? Can we use less? Can we use different? Is there a way that eliminates packaging? That should start at the design stage. And then when you're getting really advanced, you're really helping suppliers progress, and you're almost working in partnership with your suppliers to be more sustainable as an overall. That's a great place to be. And where you've got multiple big challenges like palm oil, like deforestation, you're not going to crack it on your own. So can you be part of a wider movement? Can you engage with bigger groups to create the pressure that will create the change you couldn't make on your own?
Yeah, and sometimes at Advance, they're even incentivizing. I think IKEA is incentivizing their suppliers with renewable energy funds and things like that. So it's really, they're putting money behind it too. And spelling mistake there. So whistling through what mature looks like, and this is absolutely too many options for an SME, and we've touched on some of these things, but mature supply chains have long-term goals. Okay, we'll be finished by then, I'm sure. They understand they're multi-tier. They have responsible people both in their organisation, and they know the people in the other organisation, how to make that happen. They're all over collaboration, and they know where to go to collaborate. Typically, they think globally. They support training both internally and externally. And back to Nick's point on the previous slide, really supporting their suppliers. They have a strategy. They're innovative and supporting innovation. digitalize where they can, understand their scope 3, they've optimized their network. Transport is a massive part of, especially in product or FMCG distribution models, and optimizing that network, or even service businesses. I mean, optimizing where you can is definitely supporting most
Yeah,
mature sustainable
we're
import.
working with a training business, and actually
Yeah.
they do a hell of a lot of travel. So kind of optimizing where people are located and where the training occurs has a massive impact on their scope 3.
Yeah. Resource use we've discussed, climate risk we've discussed, and circular models. So there's a lot of things in supply chain to optimize and work on to be really in the mature stage for big businesses. And if you look at a Unilever report, and Paul Pullman's a great one to follow, and watch any of his YouTubes, and he's really innovative, and he was a leader. They haven't got this done perfectly, and they've been working on this for 15, 20 years probably. So yeah, it's not easy, but there's a lot of elements. But the first step for sorry.
Yeah, you go on.
Oh, he's
Dave's
back. First step for all businesses and everything we see, and the first is have a code of conduct. Now, it can be multiple pages, it can be simple, but a code of conduct will set out the rules of engagement for businesses that work with you. We've attached one for you, this ABC Limited, and I think it's about 3 or 4 pages long, so it's yours to amend. It's a Word document, and you can, but it does touch on labour rights. It does touch on your resource use. It does touch on what you expect from environmental impact. So everything around your business. It might not be relevant to you, so extract as you like, but it is typically what the very first thing we see is is businesses all having a code of conduct and having their suppliers sign it or engage with it. In terms of sustainability regulations, there's loads already there for supply chain. So modern slave labour, everybody's got a modern slave labour statement, but I'm expecting that there is even more in terms of Supply Chain Act came in last year. There's a lot more coming. Statement isn't good enough. You really will need to understand what's going in your supply chain. But at the moment, a modern slave labour, I think you have to be 5 million turnover or something. So it might not impact SME sector, or the S's yet. There's an ISSB coming in or came in on the second half of 2022, which has a lot of disclosures around sustainability. The taxonomy is in place, so anyone doing business with Europe might start to see more pressure in their business or more regulations and requirements.
And we've seen that actually in the last those next 2 points, the EU taxonomy and the CSRD, the one below. In the last month, for the first time, we've seen people go, "Oh, we've just been asked." Because we supply it to Europe, and they should have seen it coming because it's been mapped forever. But yeah, it was a shock to their system. Yeah,
so and TCFD is coming to force. So these things are typically hitting larger businesses, but they are rolling down through the supply chains, through code of conducts and through disclosure requirements. In terms of some of the logos, there's a lot of global goals and sustainability, which has all got a huge element of supply chain in it. So these are all embedded already and they're coming. So there's global goals like the PRI, Sustainable Development Goals, greenhouse gas, we talked about in carbon, then coming to some reporting frameworks, climate disclosure, TCFD, GRI, and then there's the regulations as well, we just mentioned. So there's a hierarchy of supply chain requirements coming.
And the way we see the reporting frameworks kick in is actually supply chain driven. So it's for large corporations, it's a bit of a cop out, but what they do is say, okay, we need you to disclose your impacts through CDP, or we need you to disclose your impacts through EcoVadis or whatever it is. So they kind of use a third party accreditation standard to do the assessment for them. And we see that quite a lot, mainly from the larger corporates, but it's another angle to consider. So when you're using your supply chain, you can ask them, have you already got any certifications such as some of these? and SEDEX is another one. So that some of them are quite sort of sector specific, and they tend to be larger businesses. But other people will say, well, if you've got ISO 14001, that's good enough for us as a space. So you can give people a get out of jail if they are pretty mature and they've done a lot of progress on there and they have a certification to prove it. You can say, well, that's okay for us. We'll give you top marks in our sort of supply chain assessment. But for SMEs, again, that would be over the top. It is a challenge. Some larger corporates put out to all their suppliers, right, we need you to have EcoVadis or wherever it may be. And some of it almost eliminates the small players from being in their supply chain, which is not sustainable practice. They should be encouraging local SMEs wherever they can. So there can be a two-tiered approach. So they can allow SMEs to submit a questionnaire or have a lower level kind of standard, if you like. But on the SME options, there is, if you haven't bumped into it, the SME Climate Hub is pretty good, actually, in terms of giving you free resources, and you can put a commitment out there and you get a badge. And there's also the Better Business Act is a good resource as well.
And I think there are loads of different badges and logos depending on what your sector is. So it's worth investigating them, whether it's MSC if you're in fishing, or FSC if it's something to do with forestry, or paper or card. I mean, there's so many different badges, and probably they've all got their own criteria. I expect the harder ones to get are the more valuable to the business and more credible. So if it's something quite easy to get, it might not be as credible to the organisation. Something we want to talk about is B Corp. We see a lot. We get a lot of businesses coming to us asking about B Corp. I'm guessing everybody's bumped into B Corp. It's really, I think it's been dominated by consumer brands, but there's so many B2B businesses that are now going for B Corp certification. Excuse me. So to be a B Corp, there's lots of benefits. It is a badge scheme. It is a sign up. It does build. It's quite rigorous process, so it builds trust and loyalty. If you've got a B Corp, there's a very rigorous assessment process, so it's very credible. It does give you ethical brand differentiation. B Corps are considered to be quite ethical businesses. It's transparent and accountable. The scores you get on B Corp are all listed on their website. People can see that. And it does support impactful purchasing. You're making a good decision with your purchasing. If you, from a consumer B2C point of view, it's you're doing, you're going with an ethical brand. In B2B, a lot of the same things, but the added benefit on a B2B business that to get a B Corp is it's a whole network of businesses. The last count, I remember about 3,000 businesses, banks, financial institutions, all sorts of weird and wonderful businesses are B Corps of all sizes and all industries, but they have a lot of lockdown events that only B Corps can attend. So it's a great opportunity to support and build and collaborate. You have access to that B Corp network, so you can start. You already know that they're on the journey like you are, and you can make impacts with whatever you purchase. So there's a lot of benefits to B Corp. The assessment at the moment, although the framework's changing, but today they have 5 categories, and you have to get 80 points across all 5 categories. And no matter when you answer the questions you can do this by yourself on a B Impact assessment, so everyone can sign in for free. You can assess your own business there. You can answer the questions. You can change them. There's no impact. There's no submission. There's no cost, but you can play around to see what scores you might get, and and you can work towards putting in some. You do have to put in some policies, some evidence, and some numbers in terms of carbon footprint. But the one big thing you need to do to get 10 points out of that 80, minimum 80, is you need to change your articles of association to a standard B Corp text to say that you will take care of the environment and social and economic in your business. So you change something at Companies House in your articles of association. So it is really, this is a great quote, it is really accessible. Any company can become a B Corp, which is its big strength and a big weakness. But it is very and it says here it doesn't require the big change that businesses need. It is quite policy heavy, and when you talk to people about doing B Corp, there's quite a lot of effort, but it's because there's so many policies that they require you to have. Like, do you have a local purchasing policy? Do you have in your employee handbook, do you have something around making good travel choices for your employees? Like, it's quite policy led. Therefore, there's a little bit of challenge on the B Corp process that it's not making impact, because you just there's a lot of words, perhaps not as many measures as they might like, although it's changing. To be a B Corp is quite strict. There's it costs it does cost time and effort to get there, and there's a financial, depending on the size of your business, there's a cost to be a B Corp. The certification process can be 9 to 12 months while they're analysing everything, so it's not an overnight success. You do have to change the structure in your articles, and then you got to maintain it. And once you're a B Corp, it's something that you do every year, and you pay every 3 years to get recertified. You have to do an impact report every year. There's certain requirements you have to update on an annual basis. So pros and cons.
Yeah, so there are some pretty high profile B Corps out there, which is a challenge and potentially good. But if you look at, I think this is Nescafe, not Nescafe.
Yeah, Nespresso, yeah.
And Nespresso, sorry, yeah, the George Clooney one. They're a certified B Corp, but when you look at their process and the materials around the coffee, you just think, well, I'm not 100% convinced that they're as good as they could be. Ben and Jerry's ice cream, they were one of the big high profile ones early on. I think they're pretty good.
This is an interesting.
Yeah, go on.
Ben and Jerry's one's interesting because they're actually now owned by P&G, I think, or Unilever. And Unilever, but the whole of Unilever is not a B Corp, but Ben and Jerry's still is. So
yeah,
does that ethically sit right? I don't know. It's just a
and it's a challenge for B Corp. We like B Corp, and they're trying to get better, and they're changing the framework, and they're continuously improving it. But it just goes to show that if you rely on in your supply chain one of these certifications, it doesn't make you challenge free, if you like, because when Ben & Jerry's were purchased by the big corporate, does that change your perspective of them? And then the classic one for that is Brewdog, who were very loud and proud about their B Corp status. But then all the I wouldn't describe it as human rights, but there was certainly lots of unethical conduct happening in the business that was publicized quite widely. And B Corp, when they then went for renewal, revoked their status as a B Corp, which is probably kudos to B Corp for doing that and having the standards. Okay, so measurement and disclosures in your supply chain, and we touched on some of the things before, and we've got the questionnaires as examples, but just to whistle through them, on the right hand side and this side, we just got Unilever's got some really good reference documents in terms of what they ask. They are a really mature business from a sustainability perspective, and they're all about supply chain, so a really good place to look at, and you can look at their requirements that are kind of referenced there. But classically environmental, it is the carbon, your energy, your water and wastewater, materials, and the biodiversity is hard to measure. It's hard to get metrics on that, but that is a challenging area, that if it is a product or service that uses a lot of raw materials, that you should try. Social metrics, it's the human rights piece. So that labour conditions and modern slave labour is a big deal. Then moving into the diversity and inclusion and the community impact where you're sourced from. And when you get into that wider piece, particularly in tier 2, what's happening on the social responsibility. On the governance side of things, the kind of standard that everybody seems to be coalescing around is TCFD, this Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And because we like an acronym, that's now been taken over by the ISSB, and they have introduced an S1 and S2 standard, but it's essentially the same thing. So if you look at TCFD, that's a good place to start for what you should be doing on governance and what you should be reporting on your supply chain from a risk and opportunity and metrics perspective. And then there are some metrics that go all across the piece, waste and recycling everywhere in your supply chain. If you can get metrics on that, it's really good. Interestingly, it tends to be very low on a carbon footprint perspective, but it is it has wider biodiversity and life below water impacts as well. Innovation side of things, what's happening there, who's being innovative, how can you incentivize that in your supply chain, how can you encourage their contribution, what's happening in there. And then supplier training and capacity building. If you've got a really good supplier who's eco, it might be a startup, might be something new, how can you support them and help them develop and help them grow? So it's kind of what we would love is the sustainable businesses get more business. If you're procuring things from people, how can you feed that? How can you help the more sustainable businesses thrive and take more market share from the ones that aren't? And if everybody did that, then we're probably heading in a good direction.
And so
SMEs, sorry, go on, Rondi.
No, the SMEs, these were the supply chain metrics, and these were in your guide from last month, I think. So we skipped over the measurement from last week, but you have these, and these would be the SME top metrics we would look at. So you have those already in your guide. So they're not coming out again, but they're in a complementary set that you have. One of your resources.
So through the session today, you've got the questionnaires which indicate other metrics as well. Those Unilever metrics are a good reference point, but and so if you are trying to do that and you want to really go to town on what the metrics are, there's lots of resources out there to look at and to reference in terms of what they could be.
So we're right at the end. So sort of in wrap up, a couple of quotes. When you're small and agile, you can quickly change what you do, and that's what we like about SMEs is they can really make an impact on the sustainability topics. Walt Disney said the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So we hope that the session today plus the 4 sessions has sort of given you some tools, some ideas, some thoughts to start doing some things, however small or interesting. We want you to take away that sustainability is more than the environment. I think we've laboured that quite heavily, but it is a thing we bump into every single day. So it's really important to think about the big picture. And the final one is please ask questions. So just keep asking questions of others, because that's where some big impact, some big collaborations and some big changes can happen. That is us. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to recap, we have covered a lot in 5 sessions. We appreciate you staying with us for the journey. 1 second about us, how we help at Sustainable X is we do training, we hold workshop accelerators for businesses, we support on an ongoing basis for businesses in a little and often mode, however they need us, and support them. We help write communications and comms based heavily on measures and evidence, and I think that themes come through. And we do support boards and workers on board advisory in terms of their risk and their profiling and investor readiness. So we do a lot of other things as well. We would really, really love everybody to stay in touch, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'll never stalk you, sell to you, do anything, but we want to be here to answer any questions or just hear what you do with the information that we've provided. We'll stop recording now. I just wanted to say thank you and ask if you have any questions. We will be sending out a questionnaire. I think it's only 12 questions just on the whole program, and we'd really appreciate you to be really honest. I think it's anonymous. Please feedback on how you found the sessions, and thank you very much, and I'll stop recording.
So yes, Lara, noted, we'll make sure you get the email to the resources link.